Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this public event, the latest in the Institute for Northern Studies seminar series. And I'm very pleased to be here to chair Tara, who's going to talk about placing women, tracing journeys, female mobility, and social bonds in the Norse period. I'll just give a quick run through of the topic. So, mobility is about more than movement. In the Norse period, as today, it could be a form of agency, power, and social capital. Yet women's mobility has too often been dismissed as passive, forced, and dependent on men. Now, Tara this evening is going to challenge this assumption by exploring how female mobility in the Norse period was enacted and experienced across different spaces, from movement within the home and in the local community, through to long-distance maritime migration and travel, particularly looking forward to that bit. Women's movement, whether local or long distance, was not simply a reflection of geography, but also of social structures. The ability or inability to be mobile was shaped not just by intersectional factors such as gender, age, status, marital status, and ability, but by a person's membership of and role within dynamic, overlapping, and sometimes conflicting social groups. And of these groups, the household stood at the heart of the system, providing the social, legal, economic, and political basis for, and the social conventions that governed the mobility of both men and women. Yet the people who lived outside of permanent household ties were exposed to the precarious side of mobility, where movement became a threat rather than a form of agency. And by placing women at the centre of this analysis, Tara is going to explore how gender, status, household membership, and mobility were deeply entwined, redefining how we understand concepts of gender mobility, power, and belonging in the Norse period. So it's going to be an extremely interesting evening. And just a little word about Tara herself. She undertook her BA degree in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge and returned to further education after some years as a part-time student with us at the Institute for Northern Studies, UHI. She was awarded her MLit Viking Studies with distinction in 2020. Her dissertation examined gendered identities in the Viking Age diasporic island hubs of Orkney and the Isle of Man, and for that she won Best Dissertation Award, very well deserved, in 2020. And at the moment, she's currently a final year PhD candidate with us, focusing on, perhaps you guessed it, gender, mobility, and migration in the Norse period. And with that, I will say welcome, Tara. Looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say, and you can now take over the reins.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Before I start, I'm going to just share my screen so you can see my slides. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much. And thank you for that introduction. It feels like you've probably talked through the first couple of slides that I have, so I can probably go through those a little bit quicker today. So this evening, I'm going to be talking about some of the key themes that have come out of my thesis research, which, as Andrew said, is looking at female mobility and social bonds in the Norse period. So through that, I'm very much examining geographical mobility, but through a lens of the social groups that women belong to and the social bonds that they formed in and between those groups. So geographical mobility, it's defined in the dictionary as the ability to move or be moved and the capacity for movement. And I like this definition because it really starts to introduce the concept of agency in there. So whether you are the initiator behind some sort of mobility, or whether you're dependent, or whether it's forced. And also the capacity for movement as well. So, you know, the practical and physical enablers behind that. And those are all themes that I'll be exploring in today's talk. So I'm focusing on the Norse period, which is a broad period. From the Viking Age in the late 8th century, all the way through to the saga writing period in the 13th century. And those of you who have you've done any studying and research around this period knows that we have a patchwork of sources at our disposal that sometimes contradict each other and sometimes are fragmentary. And what we do as historians of this period is very much look at these and piece them together. So I'll be very much looking at the evidence and what that shows us, for example, with archaeology and what that shows us about that earlier Viking period, all the way through to how things have actually changed in the later 13th century, because of course gender and the norms behind it were quite different in that time. So mobility is about much more than movement. It's about power and powerlessness, control and dependency, and all of that is very much tied up with social capital. And within that, we start with this very pervasive idea in Viking and Norse studies that there is this separation from a spatial perspective between men and women. So we have these binaries of public and private and indoors and outdoors that are very much placed across gendered roles. So there's this, sort of understanding that women were active indoors, in and stocks, in Old Norse, and that they were more active in the domestic or private sphere. Whereas men were very active outdoors, apparently, and in the public and political sphere. And one of the things I'm trying to do through this research is try to deconstruct those assumptions and really probe them and to see to what extent they actually hold true. So just looking at my research questions now. These are the research questions for the thesis in its entirety. So firstly, how was female mobility enacted across the full spectrum of physical space? And that can be everything from within the home itself, all the way through to the community and district, to the other end of the spectrum, which is looking at significant geographical space overseas. And that's very much where migration comes in. Secondly, how did female mobility compare to that of men? And thirdly, what were the groups and networks that either enabled or hindered mobility? And how did this differ along gendered lines? I'm looking at two particular case studies now and doing a little bit of a deep dive into those, just to try and illustrate some of these themes that have come out in my research. So the first one is migration. And as you would expect, this is a really key area in Norse studies because of the huge amounts of population movement that we saw during the Viking Age and later on into the early medieval period as well. So people moving out of Scandinavia to other parts of the world. In particular, I'm going to be looking at the North Atlantic and Iceland in particular as well. The second case study I'm going to look at is vagrants. So this is a completely different group of people. So people who lived on the margins of society who didn't belong to these formal household groups. And, of course, by definition, they were incredibly mobile. But of course, there was also, a lot of sort of negativity towards the way that they were understood and portrayed and treated as well. So I'll be exploring, how their mobility was understood and how it differed to those who belong to those more formal social groups, such as kinship groups, friendship groups, or household groups. There we go. Sorry, my computer screen just got a little bit stuck there. So just going on to why mobility actually matters. So first of all, the social rules that govern behaviour of men and women were actually experienced spatially. So if we look at things like space and the expectations of where people would be carrying out their activities, where they would socialise, where they would conduct other activity, was very much governed along those spatial lines. And we see that with everything from within the home to movement in the local community, for example, going to the assembly family, or going to, different people's houses for feasts. So very much experienced differently by men and women. Mobility, as I've already said, is also, it can be seen as a form of agency, power, and social capital, but not always. So the case study that I'm going to be looking at today in terms of vagrants very much looks at people who were on the margins, and where, rather than being a marker of power, their mobility was seen as a marker of powerlessness. So looking at some of these examples today. In terms of approaching my mobility and migration, I'm just going to start by grounding a little bit in some of the theories and the theoretical approaches that have been used. And you can see here there's been an awful lot of different theoretical movements, models that have been used. And that's really because there were lots of different types of mobility and even lots of different types of migration as well. So migration theory is, one of the key aspects that's been used by scholars of the Viking Age. This theory, as with most of the others, has been developed in the 20th century to be used to explain population movements in the 20th century. So very different drivers in many cases. So, it doesn't always exactly match on. But there are some key factors that can be applied. So, for example, an understanding that people who are migrating may be either pushed from their existing home and or pulled by different factors. So, for example, it might be that you might be under there might be difficult political circumstances or famine, for example, that might push you from your existing home. But there might be sort of favourable economic or social factors. You might have family members or other members of your social network in another place where you feel that you can have a better life. Predatory migration theory has really been sort of developed out of migration theory, and it's a little bit of a hybrid that sort of brings in the notion of invasion as well. So, sort of very much sort of looking at sort of colonial sort of patterns, as it were. Now, of course, this works in, some examples, and we do see areas in the Norse diaspora where there has been sort of invasion and a subjugation of the host population, as it were, but that was by no means the only form of migration. And I'm going to be talking a lot about Iceland today, which was, of course, an area that wasn't inhabited previously, and that brought with it a whole, host of different challenges. But there wasn't a sort of a population that was existing within that setting. In recent years, diaspora theory has also become quite a well-used theoretical approach, and this very much approaches migration not just from a physical movement of people, but starting to look at the cultural impacts and enablers behind that. So very much looking at a notion of cultural memory, memory of a homeland, and that shared identity, as it were. And that's very useful when we think about the Norse diaspora and the connections between different people that formed, for example, across different parts of the North Atlantic. So sort of this concept of a common sort of Scandinavian heritage, but of course a different interpretation of that seen in different places. Sometimes it might be emphasized more, sometimes less. And of course, you also have these different ideas of different cultures meeting as well. And then finally, I found that transnational theory has also been very useful to underpin some of my research as well. And that very much looks at tangible reciprocity between different groups of people over quite geographically dispersed areas. So very much looking at those sort of practical economic, social, political support networks. So, of course, migration isn't the only form of mobility. It's not just those life-changing events. All of these theoretical models need to be adapted to some extent to actually address different forms of mobility. The final point here is that really, mobility is related not just to physical space, but also to symbolic space as well. So looking at how boundaries are constructed socially and how movement between and within those is actually culturally defined and enacted has been a really important part of my research as well. Okay, so I'm just going to move on now just to look at the social groups that I've been looking at and mobility. So as I mentioned at the beginning, when you are mobile or whether it's local mobility or whether it's migration, social groups and your membership of those very much can either support that mobility or inhibit it. Um, I've looked at these three overlapping circles in the middle. These are three of the main groups of social networks that you see, not just in the Norse period, but I think this is quite pervasive across different historical and cultural periods. But these are quite formal, and we see in terms of kinship. So, for example, natal kinship, which is all to do with lineage, and you might call it blood, but also affinal or sort of marriage alliances as well. But also you see what's being called fictive kinship as well. So thinking about things like fosterage, for example, or even being sort of baptismal sponsors for people as well. So different sorts of kinship can actually be formed. And that's quite structured and regulated. And we see a lot in the laws about that. Friendship as well. I mean, that's a pervasive theme across the sagas in particular. Very much about these sort of alliances between people, and very much viewing friendship as a political form, as it were, perhaps very different to how we might understand friendship in our own, sort of current modern society. Friendship actually is very interesting from a female perspective. It's been argued that it's a very androcentric, so a male-dominated term. And when you look at it from a political perspective, but actually one of the things that I'll be looking at today is the more sort of social parts of friendship, perhaps, though that might be seen in the Norse literature. And then the household as well. This was the legal and social and economic unit, the core unit, and that was comprised of a mixture of people who were related, whether it was by blood or by marriage, and also other people as well. So, lots of different types of configurations. You might have servants, you might have slaves, in there as well, and it would be quite fluid as well. So you'd have people who would join, for example, for annual working contracts. On the left here, I've just put in just some examples of other sort of social groups that you might see. So trade groups, for example. So you might see, for example, metal workers is an example where you might see these people moving around together in groups. They weren't formally attached to any households, but they were intersecting with it. You might see religious groups. So, for example, people going on pilgrimage, and then itinerants, so vagrants, I'll be talking about as well. And then on the right here, we have just some of the different types of mobility that you can apply these groups to. So migration, I've talked about, but you also might see sort of war and conflict driving people and population movement, all the way through to these moving days, which were these annual contracts that you saw. They were outlined in the Icelandic laws. But what you also see is quite a lot of fluidity and change within that as well, both in terms of the membership of those groups, and also in terms of how they intersect with each other as well. And I'll be looking at that through today's talk. The last couple of slides I've got on theory before I get into some of the meat around migration. So I talked a little bit about mobility as a form of social capital, but of course it isn't always a form of social capital. So this term motility, it was coined by sorry, I'm covering this up, by Michael Flam and Vincent Kaufman. And it reflects a person's ability to be mobile through their ability to access and leverage opportunities, resources, knowledge, skills, and networks. And this has been a really useful way of me actually approaching mobility for my thesis. So what I've done, I've developed that slightly and used it to pull together this framework. And this is very much the lens through which I have conducted my research. So I'll just very briefly, talk through some of these factors. So we have push-pull factors to start with. So these are some of the socio-economic and political factors that might be pushing a person from their place of origin and pulling them to a new place. We also have the cultural understanding and whether it was legitimate for that person to be mobile. Was it socially acceptable? Did it fit in with cultural norms around expectations of gendered roles and behaviours, or was it a deviation from that? The social and personal context of people is really, really important. And this is where the whole intersectional idea comes in. It wasn't just gender, of course. We're looking at age, status, marital status, personalities as well, were very important, and just personal circumstances. And then also, was that person the initiator in the mobility or movement? Were they a dependent on others, or was it forced upon them? We then have different types of, was it different types of mobility? So was it local, was it regional, or was it interpolity? Was it between different cultural or geographic zones? And then we introduced this idea of whether it was permanent or temporary, was it seasonal, and what was the duration as well. And I've found in my research that rather than thinking about things in terms of binary of permanent and temporary, it's much easier to think about things in terms of a sliding scale. We also have the reason for mobility, so what was the trigger for that? And also, just as importantly, the means to travel and the mode of transport, so the access, through economic and social means to those things. And also the networks that have enabled this. What were the networks that the person belonged to that either helped their mobility or hindered it? And also, what were the benefits or disbenefits to them and their social group from that? Before moving on to the examination of migration, I thought it might just be useful to provide this is quite a well-known example from a saga, a Laxdæla saga, that many of you may be familiar with from a Viking studies perspective. And Gudrun Osvis she is sort of one of the main female characters within the saga. And there was a particular scene within this where she's having a conversation with Kjartan, who she's very close with, and it's expected that they will marry. And he's going to travel abroad, and she asks to go with him. Now, from a perspective of young men of a certain status in Iceland, we see this as a recurring theme throughout the sagas, and a lot of scholars have written about this, where this was very much seen as it was almost like a rite of passage for a young man. They would travel abroad, whether they were trading or raiding, and it gave them personal renown and reputation, and also economic means as well. So, they were benefiting in many ways from that socially and economically and politically. And Gudrun asks to go with him, and he pushes back and says no, it wouldn't be appropriate for her. She still lives within her natal household. She lives with her father, who's quite elderly, and she's expected to look after him. So, not only does, there is a social, the social norms are such that she's not expected and it's not really seen as legitimate for her to go away. There's also this pull that is placed upon her to stay at home, to look after her family. And, she wouldn't, there's no expectation that she's going to go away and get this same sort of social capital that Kjartan as a young man is going to get. So really, everything sort of stacked against Gudrun from this perspective. All of these aspects. She doesn't have the social reasons. It would be outside of expected behaviour. And her family, would expect her to stay at home. Also, she can't access the means to travel. She doesn't have the necessary economic and social capital to get a ship, for example, if she can't persuade Kjartan to let her go with him. Or the personal access, to that mode of transport. So hopefully that's just a fairly familiar example to some of you watching today about how I've been approaching this particular model. So I'm now going to move on to migration, and this is, this is probably when we think about mobility, it's probably the biggest area that we think about. I'm focusing specifically on Iceland for a number of reasons. One, that it provides a particularly useful example around some of the challenges, just because it was an uninhabited place, but also because there's a lot of source evidence which enables us to have quite a comparative view of this. If we think about female migration, there are a number of assumptions that are made, and this is quite pervasive in research, not just about the Viking Age, but more broadly as well, though we are starting to see scholars of the Norse period start to question and challenge this and provide evidence against it. But it's useful just to quickly outline what those assumptions have been. So firstly, that men are the main migratory actors, and that women's migration is usually determined by men, either in terms of forcing it or them being dependent on men. The second is that there's a pioneer phase of migration that tends to be undertaken by younger men, with only limited involvement of women. And thirdly, that women are unlikely to move to unsafe places. Hence, the further migration is from the Scandinavian homelands. The more likely that men are to be the main migratory actors. And actually, I mean, there's been some work by Shane MacLeod actually looking at 9th century burials in the campaigning period in England, which shows a much higher ratio of female burials than was probably expected in the past. So we're starting to see this idea that women were present in the earliest phases of migration, and that they would go to unsafe places. The fourth assumption that I'll be looking at is that there was a lot of forced migration of women during the Viking Age, with an assumption that many of those female migrants, particularly to Iceland, were slaves. And I'll be looking at that as we go through. So if we start to look at the different gendered patterns of Icelandic settlement, this is where some of the challenges of the sources come in. So lots of written sources, but I'm just going to focus quickly on Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, which outlines the initial land takers or landnam, that the settlers who took land when they first arrived in Iceland. And when we look at this, this tells us that there's only 13 out of 400 land takers that were women. Of course, there were other women mentioned in some of the accounts. They might have been dependents, family, wives, or children. But it's quite a stark number here. So we have this ratio of 6-1, which is, quite significant. The second set of evidence is burial evidence, and there's an analysis of 99 skeletons from furnished burial, so those with grave goods, from that earliest period of settlement, show that 68% were male and 32% female. So we still see this disparity, but it's a much closer ratio. It's worth just mentioning that both of these types of source are very, very imperfect. So, if we think about Landnámabók, clearly there was sort of an intention behind this. It was very much setting out a foundational story, and not everyone was going to be mentioned within that. So there may not have been a very strong reason for mentioning women. And with burial evidence, what we have is only a fraction of the people who were afforded a burial. So it's a very, very small data set, but it does give you an indication of the fact that there were women present in that earliest stage. And of course, one would expect that they were going to a new place. If you're going to perpetuate society, you need both men and women. So it's, you know, it's not, no surprises there. One of those assumptions that I talked about was that uh, that the settlement of Iceland was very much driven by women who were slaves of either British or Gallic origin, and also Scandinavian men who were free. So there's this kind of this assumption that the founding population was, you know, these men from Scandinavia who took women with them by force from the areas that they went to first around the Irish Sea Zone and Britain. So, you know, if we start to deconstruct that a little bit, so one of the other arguments is that settlement was very labour intensive. Of course, it was labour intensive. They're going to a new place. They don't have any established farming, or no one to draw on, no support networks. They were really starting from scratch. So, of course, it was incredibly labour intensive. There has been an argument that it was, you know, relying on slave labour. But how do those two assumptions fit together? Or one, you know, one statement, you know, it's you need lots of people. But if it was unfree women, do we have this idea of it was unfree British and Gallic women who were doing all of the work? I put a picture in here. It's a little bit tongue in cheek, I guess, for quite a few hundred years later. But, you know, we've got a picture here of apparently an Icelandic man working and Icelandic women working. And if we follow this sort of chain of logic that it was all sort of female slaves, but, you know, slave labor had really, you know, was what was needed behind the settlement of Iceland, that's kind of the picture that we end up with, which probably isn't realistic in the slightest. So in reality, what we probably saw was a much more complex picture. So I'm not going to talk in any detail about slavery as such, but there's been a lot of work around this. And, you know, at a sort of a very high level, it's important to point out that during that settler period, Iceland lacked the scale and size and complexity to support a true slave economy mode of production. It was far more likely that it was everyone rolling their sleeves up and getting involved, because people were living very close to the subsistence line. While unfree people were undoubtedly part of the migratory groups, and we see this across the sources, and it's one of the things I'll be talking about shortly, it's very, very likely that those groups were comprised of both men and women. So if we look at some of the DNA evidence here, so I talked about this idea of Scandinavian men and Gallic or Irish or British women. There's been quite a few studies done of both ancient DNA, but also the DNA of modern populations, and these again are quite problematic sources. But if we look at them broadly, it does support that idea. Um, what we see also, and in this particular study here that I've referred to, is that the genome, so the genetic sort of background of the settlers, is closer to the original Scandinavian and British contemporary populations than modern Icelanders. Now, a big reason for that is, of course, genetic drift. So this was a small population, so any sort of, nuances or anomalies are going to be perpetuated. So it wasn't particularly, representative, and you expect that. But it's also likely to be, and this, one of the things that this study suggested was that it was the higher reproductive success of those with Norse heritage. But what I would probably argue as an extension of that is that what we're seeing perhaps is the original settlers were comprised of both, unfree people who were men and women of British and Gallic background. But really what we're seeing is more reproductive success for the women than for the men. A piece of evidence that might support that is looking at some burials. So we've got these farm-based burial mounds, and there's this particular example here where we're seeing that immigrant women were more likely to be given farm-based burial mounds. than women from Scandinavia. So that's a really sort of interesting piece, and also for men as well. So we're seeing that these women are being afforded a burial. It takes a lot of money and time and resource to give people a burial, with especially with grave goods in there. So that certainly doesn't go along with the idea that these women were slaves or unfree people. So what we're probably seeing is a much more complex picture, where we see stepping stone and circular and ongoing and bidirectional movement across and between Scandinavia and different parts of the Irish Sea zone, and also in Britain as well. So, what we're seeing potentially here is, an ongoing sort of situation up to about the year 1000, when there were incoming women who were moving into Iceland, perhaps marrying Icelandic men. So, do we see here network building, that continuation of support across the Norse diaspora, as well as perhaps status as well. So it's certainly not as easy just to say that, there were lots of women being taken against their will. Of course, there were people being taken against their will, but it's a little bit more nuanced than perhaps is sometimes argued. I'm going to move on now just to give an example of a very famous character in who appears in lots of the literary sources that we have. So in the Book of Icelanders, in Landnámabók, and also across multiple sagas as well. And that's Alva. And I'm not even going to attempt in a public forum to try and pronounce her surname, but it's usually interpreted as deep-minded or wise. What we've got here with this map is these are the places that she went to. So we can start to see, this idea of stepping stone migration. She started off life living. She lived in Norway. She left Norway with her family. Her father, Ketil Flatnose, decided it was in the sagas. It was time to leave, because of political instability and a major falling out with King Harold Finehair. So they left. They went to the Hebrides, and at some point, according to the saga sources, she married Olafur hin Hviti, Olaf the White, who was a warlord and a warrior king who'd apparently conquered Dublin. So she's moved from Norway, she's gone over to the Hebrides, and then she's quite active in this Irish sea zone around here, though it doesn't go into any detail about that. At some point, she's widowed, and at that point, she moves with her adult son and his family back to the Hebrides, and also Caithness as well, which is Caithness, if we remember, is part of the Orkney earldom. Um, and there she stays until the death of her son, and at that point, she leaves, and that's when she goes off on this sort of big North Atlantic move. She goes to Orkney first of all, then to the Faroes, and then to Iceland. And interestingly, all along the way, she's marrying off her granddaughters as she goes. So very much taking that sort of controlling sort of role. So it's interesting, her mobility was very much controlled. First of all, she was dependent on her father's decision, according to the sagas. Then she was, supporting and following her son. It's only when she's widowed and her son dies that she really takes the reins, and she's sort of driving that migration. So this is all taking place, according to the sagas, around the second half of the ninth century. It's a very sort of tumultuous time, lots of political and military upheaval in this time. So that's the backdrop that this movement is taking place against. So we see, just moving on quickly, I'll just talk about this quote from Laxdæla saga. So I'll paraphrase. So basically, when she learns that her son is dead and her father is, he's also dead at this point, she has a ship built in secret, apparently, gets all of her valuables, prepares for the voyage, and goes off with her surviving kinsfolk. And we can be no doubt about the admiration of the saga author here. He talks about, or that this woman escaping in such hazards. She had all of this wealth and a large retinue with her, and we see what a paragon among women she was. So from this, we start to see that she's really mobilizing this network that she has. If we start to to think again about the means to travel, she would have had to sort of rely on vertical as well as horizontal relationships to get the resources, to whether the ship was built, probably unlikely in a short period of time, or whether she got access to a ship, but also to get the crew as well. So again, we see that she's depicted this as this ideal sort of figure, as it were. And we have to remember that she is a literary figure, not a historical figure, and I'll come on to that shortly. A slight deviation here, but this is what this made me think of, the perfection that we start to see with Auther. She conforms at every step of the way to the expectations of idealized feminine behavior. She sits in the background while she's a daughter and a wife. It's only when she's widowed that she really sort of mobilizes. So it's a very socially sanctioned sort of activity and agency that she has. And this really reminded me of this example here that we see from Pride and Prejudice. And this is the example where Caroline Bingley and Mr. Darcy are talking about what it takes to be an accomplished woman. And, music, singing, drawing, dancing, languages, extensive reading, a very, very long list. And probably highly unachievable, as we see here in this quote, that not being surprised at knowing six, I rather wonder at you knowing any. So, of course, idealized femininity is, of course, culturally and historically determined. This is a very different idea to the one that we see in the Norse period. And of course, we would have seen variation between the Viking Age and the saga writing period. But perhaps what we do see is that ideals, whether it's of femininity or masculinity, are perhaps unattainable. So going back to Auther, my question would be, is she too good to be true? I mean, so she doesn't deviate from those idealized elite female behavioral norms at any time at all. It's only when she's widowed, as I mentioned, that she really mobilizes herself and she takes control of her own mobility, but also those of her grandchildren and her network of followers and dependents. Always she's acting for her in her family's best interests. As a very brief aside here, did she exist? I've mentioned that she's she appears in the Icelandic sources. She is very much a literary figure. In those sources, she's married to Olaf the White, but she and her son are only mentioned in the Icelandic sources. Interesting, if we look at the Irish Annals and the Pictish Chronicles, where and scholars have often equated Olaf, her husband, with Amlaib Conung, though that is it's contested. We see a different picture. So in those sources, Amlaib is married twice, not to an Icelandic or a Norwegian lady, but to an Irish woman and then to a Scottish princess. So we're probably seeing here a later construction that was very much part of this foundational legitimizing myth across the North Atlantic settlements. And, in this model, a Norse woman would probably be seen as much more appropriate than a Celtic one. I'm just going to move on now to the experience of migration itself and that sort of travel process. There's not a huge amount of information that the sources themselves they don't give very much detail about this, but it's important, particularly from a gendered perspective, to start to try and understand this and what these experiences might have been and how that impacted the social groups that people were part of and maybe changed them over a period of time. So I've talked about the fact that households were the central units of social life, but we also see that through the migration process, not everybody in a household or a family or a kinship group is going to migrate. Only certain people are going to migrate. And scholars for some years have been, looking at these communities that sort of form very strong bonds and, cohesive social units that go through these sort of very risky and traumatic upheavals of migration together. Um, so this has been developed as well. So, not just in terms of, seaborne travel, but this idea of understanding the home and how it's defined as a relational concept rather than just a physical place, as it were. And that's been extended by Christian Kuijmans in relation to Viking camps, which has been quite a useful theoretical approach that I've applied just to understanding what the social groups were and how they might have shifted over time. So when we apply this sort of idea as home as relational and evolving rather than fixed and place bound to maritime migration, we can see that it does apply fairly well. So first of all, we have this sort of liminal period, both spatially and socially. So the migration period, that travel time was very, very much bounded in time. We also have this idea of fracturing and reforming household units, which we see as well. And I'll come on to that a little bit shortly. And also interdependency, both in terms of tasks and emotions that we see within the people who are travelling together. So all of this has the potential to disrupt hierarchies, roles, and identities. So I just wanted to provide this example here, actually. So as we have very little information from the sources, what I've done is I've looked at some sort of modern day this modern day example, a contemporary account. We have to be careful because obviously it's a different time, and the values and the experiences, of course, are going to be different. But there are some themes that are quite interesting. So just briefly, this example here, this book that was published, this was a group of 9 men who attempted a voyage from Greenland over to Lanso Meadows, which is the presumed place of Vinland over in North America. And this book talks about the accounts. So, he talks about the very cramped space, living on a single deck, eating, sleeping, working, socializing, all in very, very close proximity. And what we see in this is very much, as well as forming of close bonds, we also see fractures as well appearing. So he talked about cliques appearing amongst the crew. So certain people at the beginning of the voyage would congregate in different parts of the ship, even though it was a very, very small area. And we start to see that there's a spatial element of how the community is being experienced. But that ironed itself out over time. There were some people that sort of went by the wayside and didn't go on the full voyage. So you're always going to see people who don't gel as part of those groups. But this quote here, I just thought was really, really useful because it just gives you a sense of what I was talking about in the previous slide. So these guys are no longer my crew, and I'm not the captain. They were not even just friends. They are my family. Snorri, which is the name of their ship, has been our community, our home. So I'm just going to move now just to look at the composition of the group in Alder's migration. So we can see here that it's a mix of different people. So at the top here, we have her family. So we have her daughter-in-law, and we also have all of her grandchildren in there. And as I mentioned, we see them, those granddaughters being married at different points across those different stopping points that Alder took in this migratory journey across the North Atlantic. We also have somebody, Dalacol, who was described as her most respected man, so a very strong ally, and he was married to one of Alder's granddaughters. And then we also have this description of 20 men. Who were a mixture of freeborn men and freed men. So, in other words, these were people who were unfree, on that spectrum of unfree. Really interestingly, six of these people were actually granted land, and they're outlined in Landnamabok, which is really quite interesting. So we see this idea of forming relationships between people, and then these bonds that are, so a real disruption of hierarchies, as it were. Interestingly, one of these people, and we see a mixture of sort of Gallic names and Norse names, which kind of shows the different points of sort of movements, and how different people and cultures were coming together. But one of these people in here, Vitil, was actually the grandfather of another very famous travelling woman, Gudrida Thorbjarnardottir, who appears in the Vinland sagas over 100 years later. So, it's quite interesting that we see this social mobility as well as geographical mobility as well. So just comparing the evidence. So, does this stack up? What sort of groups are we seeing together? So first of all, and just talk about one example of some burials in Iceland, a place called Dalvik, where there are 8 burials, a mix of women and men who were immigrants. They didn't grow up in Iceland. Interestingly, they had different strontium signatures. So that's the isotopes that will show it appears in the enamel in your teeth. It forms in the first few years of childhood. And interestingly, it shows that they all grew up in different places. So here in this burial ground, these graves of people all grew up in separate places. They were not family. So we can start to see that, from this perspective, migration theory is holding true. We also see lots of different configurations as well in terms of the types of groups settling. It wasn't just family members, though we do interestingly see that family groups tend to be painted in a far more positive light than other group formations, particularly if women were travelling without any male family members here. There's just an example here from Eyrbyggja Saga that talks about one of Audr's brothers, Bjorn, who had so many kinsmen that there was no family to compare. So you start to see this idea of people, even if they haven't moved at the same time, congregating together along these sort of ideas of chain networks, as it were. For the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this slide here, which was to talk about Vinland, and just some of the differences there, because time's making a fool of me, and I still want to talk through some of the experience of people who lived a life on the move, as it were, as itinerants and vagrants. So I've talked about the fact that the household was the fundamental social unit from a social legal perspective. It also had this sort of shared sense of identity as well in terms of shared consumption and production. And in Iceland, there are a number of mechanisms that stopped people falling outside of those households. So social safety nets, as it were. So, for example, there were moving days, Fardaga, at the end of May each year, where where people would basically take a contract to go and work within a house. But there was also kinship obligations. So people had an obligation to provide for and give a home to their kin as well. And there was also something called the Hrepa, which was a regionally based sort of social unit, which would almost like a social security unit of about 20 households as well. But people did fall through the gaps, and it's highly likely that households were unable to employ all of the people all of the time, and that men, women, and children could be vagrant. And we see in the laws and also in the sagas these different words in Old Norse that refer to this, very much focusing on the mobility side of it, the walking. So we have gongu mathra, for example, or gongu kona as another one, or house walking, moving between houses. The Gragas and also the sagas, give this sense of a collective social anxiety about homelessness and vagrancy. And although I've talked about mobility being a form of agency and power in some cases, This is the direct opposite, the inverse of that. So vagrants are defined by their very name as being mobile, but they're also understood as it being pointless and lacking purpose. So they're very much seen as social others, as it were. Just very briefly to talk about household membership and work. So Gragas, which are the Icelandic laws, give quite a few sort of outlines of how household composition may have taken been controlled. So we see here, for example, that in the first piece here, that men, they were expected to move on moving days, as were women as well. But also there's this proviso here that they could also move at midsummer. So probably what we're seeing is an idea that, not everybody could be employed for a whole year, and that, for example, during the summer or during the harvest, when things were very busy, you would take people on. We've also got this in the second example, this idea of perhaps men and women taking work contracts and living in different places. And, if that is the case, they're to spend 2/3 of the time in the male man's lodging and 1/3 in the wife's lodging. So that starts to give us a sense that female work may have not been as highly valued. And we have other examples of that too. And then we also have this idea of female agency as well. So, if that the husband couldn't find a place of work for his wife, he would actually have the ability, or she would have the ability to choose somewhere herself, as well. But we start to see how difficult this must have been for families, particularly being over different spaces. So although vagrancy, you would see men, women, and children as vagrants, there was a different gendered experience, and we see that in a number of different ways. Firstly, the access to jobs outside of moving days, which is really important. Whether they could get employment if they didn't have those annual contracts, the sense of physical experience and danger, as well, and also the sanctions based on on vagrants. You can see here that they're quite brutal actually. So this first one here for men, that it's lawful to castrate vagrants. And you're not going to be, there's no legal penalty for that. And also from a woman's perspective, it's if a man gets a vagrant woman pregnant, there's no, that's not a problem per se, but he does have to provide for her and the child, and until the child is born and she's recovered from her confinement. So what we're seeing here very much is, it's a sense of the sanctions are focused on limiting social burden. They're not they're thinking about people not reproducing if they're vagrants, and creating more members of the population who are dangerous and living outside of those sort of social controls, as it were. Um, so, and also, sorry, the final point that I just wanted to make about the different gendered experience, and I'll come on to it in a moment, is the different social groups that they may have belonged to. If we look at some of the men here, and I'm just going to sort of look at this briefly in terms of that seasonal work outside of contracts for annual working days, we start to see that there are examples of this within the law. So there were there was the ability to actually sort of be outside of those annual working contracts. We see that here, and I've just underlined the key points here. So I'll take the second example here. So if a man fishes until midsummer and then joins a household, so there's an idea that you might take on different jobs at different times of the year. So fishing at some point and then perhaps joining a household, perhaps during the harvest. So different jobs undertaken by different people. We also, get this idea that there may have been more work available for vagrant men than women. I've talked about the fact that it's likely that vagrant men had more opportunities available to them, probably because their labour was more highly valued, maybe because of their physical strength, for example. So interestingly, in Gragas, it does talk about the fact that a household was only deemed to be single-handed if it was if a man didn't have a boy or a man over the age of 12 to help him. So that physical labour from men was seen as perhaps more highly valued. And we also see this idea of, taking lots of different jobs. There's a fantastic example in Jarl Saga of somebody who is an assassin, a field worker, and also good at a great many other things. In terms of women, there's not really many examples of women working outside the household, but there's a really, really interesting one here that is around a lady called Oddbjorg, who goes around the district and she sees into the future. So she's sort of like a soothsayer, as it were. And this is an area, these traveling sorceress or seeresses is quite a big theme that we see outside of Iceland in some of the other sagas, but also in the archaeological record as well. But this is quite interesting because we see that perhaps this woman was actually moving around at different times to actually try to make a living out of this. And it could well have been something that she was, relying on at parts of the year and not in other parts, other times. Another final interesting point of this is, we hear about the relationship between her and the housewives. So what we start to see is this female homosocial relationship. So it was a social role which was mediated by women and controlled by women. And that's something in terms of social groups you don't really, you don't really think about perhaps when you're thinking about these more formal structures of kinship or friendship. But here you start to see perhaps some more informal social groups and networks that went across different statuses and different types of women. Just very quickly, just bringing back to that point about seasonal work. These are examples of outside of winter, outside of Iceland. But here we've got the traveling vulva, the sorceress, and I've just highlighted a couple of examples here where we're told that these women travelled around as seeresses during the course of winter, which begs the question, what were they doing during the summer months? And, it's possible, and I would probably argue that in these cases, it may well be that they were, employed in seasonal agricultural work in the summer. And it may have been very difficult for them to find short-term employment outside of those very busy sort of harvest times, for example. So in the winter, some women may have travelled around. So again, just a sort of an interesting way of looking at those female and male differences. There are also there's some evidence as well from the sagas that there were different informal social groups for vagrants as well, and we see this as quite different for men and women. So most of those examples that we see are actually for women. So we see this idea of women traveling around in the sagas, and they play a very sort of literary role. They're usually there as a narrative function to move the saga narrative forwards, but we also often see them moving together in small groups. Now, that doesn't serve a narrative function. These women, they don't have particular personalities. They're very much painted in this sort of narrative trope of sort of gossipers, as it were. So there's no reason for them from a literary perspective for them to be moving around in small groups. So it's much more likely, therefore, that it was a recognizable feature of society. Interestingly, we don't really have that from men. There's one example in one of the sagas, actually in Gisla Saga, when we read about someone who's a Gongu Madhra who is traveling around, but it's much more as part of a trade group, as it were. So a very different sort of social group to the ones that these vagrant women were moving in. So if we look at just the case for these female sort of vagrant informal groups, so it was absolutely would have been a survival technique for one of the most isolated and vulnerable groups in society. It would have also provided a limited form of personal protection, companionship, and much needed relational support. So I talked a little bit earlier about friendship being perceived in terms of political terms. This is much more at a personal and survival level. And also potentially it may have given them some form of collective agency to aid their bargaining power and value to households as they provided these sort of intermittent services. I'm just going to finish up by giving a couple of examples, actually, which bring this to life, both of them from Njál Saga. So the first example here, we have this group of women who are described as travelling on a journey across Eyjafjall district. It's a journey of about 60 kilometres in all. And they're travelling between different farms in their usual method of spreading news and very much a serving a literary focus. However, we can start to get this idea when we look at the sort of the landscape and the distance here of the hardship that this would have been. They're traveling on foot, they're carrying belongings with them. It's pretty treacherous. And even where they end up, the housewife Bergthora actually asks them how they actually crossed the icy river. So there's a real recognition, even in the sagas, of the peril of traveling in harsh conditions across quite dangerous terrain. The second example here, one of my particular favourites. So there's a very famous example in Njál Saga of some stolen cheese. And much as that might sound quite a comic episode, there's quite a serious undercurrent behind this. Not only does it trigger quite a lot of uh, strife, shall we say, in the saga, but it also gives you a sense of just how important food was, and how hard it could be to survive in Iceland during that sort of settlement period. And in this example, some cheese has been stolen, and Morva comes up with this idea of how to uncover the identity of the thief of the cheese. So he gets these women to go traveling around with some little items that they can give to housewives as a bit of a ploy, so they can go and find out some gossip and see if they can find out what's been going on. And all in all, they're gone for half a month. And ultimately they find out, somebody gives them cheese in payment, so they find out who the culprit is. And what we see in this map here, this is the district and the farms in the district where these group of women would have been travelling around together for those 2 weeks. We don't know exactly. We're told where they started and where they finished, which is marked by the little stars on here. But over those 2 weeks, they would have been travelling around that whole period together. So again, quite difficult, for them, but they're traveling around together. That they clearly would have had a good understanding of the terrain and the local environment, as it were. And interestingly, again, we have this idea of them being, going to see the housewife. So we have this idea of these informal and hierarchical groups of women across society, not just these formal social group structures. So just final slide now, and concluding thoughts. So just based on all of the things I've talked about today, we can clearly see a differentiation between good and bad mobility and migration. And whether something is defined as being good and bad, depends on a few different things. So the composition, function, and experience of these different mobile groups and communities. I've talked about the centrality of the household. So if you're part of a household, clearly that sort of empowers you with your mobility. If you're outside of a household, very much you're denigrated within society. It's also tied up with power relations and dynamics and social norms, as well. Whether your movement, whether it's mobility at a local level or migration, is socially sanctioned, and how that is viewed, and also your ability to access and control resources. So I think, ultimately, what we've looked at here is that, some of these binaries that I was talking about in the beginning, the public, private, inside, outside, they don't really hold water when we look at these different forms of mobility. Certainly, women were migratory actors, and they also demonstrated that, they did move around at a local and regional level. Though, of course, we do see gendered variation in there as well. We also see that mobility is relational. So it's, to be mobile, you need to be supported in some shape or form by others, by other groups. So whether it's economic support or political support or social or practical support, it's absolutely intrinsic. So those social groups are great enablers, but they can also hold things back as well. And then finally, just some of the insights that around social relationships and hierarchies, not just between men and women, and not just to do with intersectional factors such as status, age, and culture, but also starting to put these female groups, these more informal female social groups and networks, a little bit more to be seen. These were not flat structures; they were hierarchical. So I think there's probably more to be seen from that perspective as well, and more nuance than perhaps has been seen before. So thank you for listening. Finally, a big thank you to my PhD supervisors as well for all of their support over the last few years. Oh, you're on mute, Andrew.
I pressed it and it stayed off. Thank you very much, Tara, for a fascinating talk. It's always good to hear new things and to get the brain working in new ways. And you certainly have done that this evening. I don't know whether you know that I was involved in a program about Guðrúður Þorbjarnardóttir. You showed a picture of from the film, from the documentary. So I was involved in that, in the Gaelic version of the episode. So ever since then, I've had a sort of interest in the great distances that people were able to to go in the Middle Ages, and particularly women like Guðrúður. Well, you've said a lot of very interesting things. So I was under the impression that it was recent DNA research which had shown that from the ancient DNA that the founding population of Iceland was about 57% Norse, if we can say there's such a thing as Norse DNA, and 43% Gaelic British, however we want to define that. And that if you look at paternal lineages and matrilineal lineages, there's about 80% of the paternal lineages, why DNA is from the Norse world, and 60% of the mitochondrial is from the British, Gaelic, Irish world. So that it's clear that in the initial founding population, you talk about the genetic drift, of course, which is very important, but the initial population, there seems to be a preponderance of Norse men and Gaelic women, with some mixture in between. And I was just wondering, you say that it's likely that these women exercised agency, but how can that be? Because there can't have been very much time in Ireland or the Hebrides for the mixing or whatever to have taken place, for the Norse men to have persuaded the Gaelic women that it was a great idea to head off with them into towards Iceland. I mean, how do you get that amount of cultural mixing, conversation? How do you get the two sides communicating so quickly over that? Well, that's one question. Just think about that. The other, I'm doing this thing that you should never do, but in case I forget,
Well, write it down.
I wondered, why would there not be enough Norse women if Norse women were acting, had lots of agency for traveling across the sea? Why weren't there enough of them to go to Iceland? Why did the Norsemen have to acquire, persuade, attract insular, we use the word insular women to go with them to Iceland? Was it perhaps something to do with status? Now, you've already said that they weren't necessarily slaves, but some of them would be. But it could be somewhere in between. Norse women at that point weren't so keen to travel because they were all happy at home, whereas lower class insular women, they were up for it. Yeah, we'll go.
That's a lot of question in there,
I
Andrew.
know it
I
is. I
shall
know.
I shall try to I'll go through in well I think yeah probably all towards the same sort of answer. So I think that the best way to understand this migration across the Irish Sea zone and into the North Atlantic is very much as stepping stone migration. So, what was happening was, these migration journeys, that were undertaken were taking place across multiple generations, as it were. So if we take, let's take, for example, what was happening in Ireland. So we know that there were Norsemen, in particular, who were going over to Ireland. We see this appearing in different sources, whether it's the later sagas or the Irish chronicles. And they were there for some particular time. They then left. They went to places, like the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man, where there were again sort of populations. So I think what we're seeing is that there were this sort of, these relationships were forming over different generations. So by the time that people were going to Iceland, they weren't, what we're not talking about necessarily is pure sort of there's no such thing as pure sort of cultural identities. You can't get a pure Scandinavian, or I mean it's so mixed. So I think what we're seeing is sort of different intermarriage and contact happening over multiple generations, so that by the time people got to Iceland, there were certain people that they may have I mean, and just because somebody was genetically from a sort of a Gallic or a British background, that doesn't mean that they weren't culturally Norse. So this is, some of the other challenges that we have from these evidence bases, that you can't necessarily see how people would identify, so I mean, the Isle of Man is quite an interesting one, actually. So I haven't talked about that today, but if you think about the early burials that you saw on the Isle of Man, it was almost exclusively furnished burials for Scandinavian men. But just a generation later, you start to see all of these crosses being raised to women. So again, there we see very quickly um, a sort of a shift, as it were. So it's quite possible that maybe there were women who were part of that earlier migration from or that movement from Ireland over to the Isle of Man, who may have been Christian and hence not appeared in the furnished burial record. So I think it's quite complex. Certainly not sort of creating a picture where all of these women were showing their power and saying, right, I want to go off to Iceland, because there would have been lots of people, whether they were women or men, who were forced to go, and they went without their will. But I just think it's more nuanced than perhaps has been thought in the past.
Very eloquently put. Well, where would you put Shetland in this? Because the amount of Norse mitochondrial DNA in the Shetland population is much higher
Mm.
than would, well, not than we would expect, but it's higher than in Iceland, for example.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't looked specifically at Shetland, but I have looked at Orkney in the past, and I think it's probably a similar pattern around that. So, I mean, how I would sort of look at that is, I mean, again, you see these ideas of sort of stepping stone migration. If you think sort of geographically, look at where Orkney and Shetland are in compared to in compare. Sorry, get my teeth back in comparison to Norway, and then Iceland on the other side. There's some distance between them. Um, it's interesting. So what we probably see from that is more of we do see more of an equal migration to Shetland and Orkney. What's really interesting is this, that sort of flies in the face of this idea that women only went to safe places, because Orkney and Shetland didn't fall into the category of uninhabited. They had thriving, um, a thriving Pictish population, and it was not going to, whether you believe that there was a peaceful assimilation or whether there was a complete annihilation of the Pictish people, it certainly wasn't going to be a safe place. So that's another really interesting example where you may have seen women and men moving together, but certainly, women being there for the earlier phases and moving to unsafe and contested places.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, just before we round up, is there anything, Tara, that you think, oh, I wish I'd said that?
Um, I don't think so. I'm conscious that I went over time anyway. So no, I don't think I've got any final thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for a very enjoyable and thought-provoking talk, and for introducing your PhD research to us. It's yeah, very timely and very interesting. And as I say, if you go and look at the documentary Antastalíche, which is the Gaelic version of The Far Traveller, about Guðrýður, you'll see me on it, and I'm not
I
saying
should
that's
have had a
necessarily a good
picture of
thing,
you,
but there
Andrew.
we go. So, thank you very much, and farewell, everyone. Thanks for your attendance, and look out for the next of these INS public seminars. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you. Bye bye.